the meeting to order for the East Bank Development Authority. First item on the agenda is the public comment period pursuant to Tennessee Open Meetings Act. Is anyone here in the audience would you like to address the board? I don't see anyone. So we'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Consider the approval of the minutes for the February 26th authority meeting.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Next item, the presentation of the intergovernmental agreement between Metro and the East Bank Development Authority. And I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Mendez and Mr. Solomon.
All right. Good morning, Chair. Thank you, and everybody. I'm Bob Mendez from the Mayor's Office, and we've got Saul Solomon here. Mr. Solomon represents you all. And so I've got a slide deck to give some highlights of the proposed intergovernmental agreement. And we're going to tag team this. And for this presentation, I'm giving the perspective of Metro, and Saul is giving the perspective of as counsel for you all.
Don't sign anything.
We are not asking for a vote today, just process-wise. We're trying to get you all, as well as Metro Council, each 2 touches on this agreement before either body votes. So we're anticipating that y'all will discuss it today, not vote. And then this would appear as a resolution on the Metro Council's April 15th agenda. We anticipate that the Council's East Bank Committee will have a meeting sometime in mid-April where they'll get basically the same presentation you guys are getting today, and they'll have a chance to answer questions. For the April 15 meeting of the Council, we would ask them to defer 1 meeting, and then y'all will be back on April 22nd, and we would ask for a vote at that time. And then on May 6th would be the next Council meeting, and we'd ask the Council to vote on the resolution at that time. And so if both bodies were amenable, by the time we got to May 6th, it would have been approved by both entities. So with that, I'll dive into the presentation. This is just a summary of what we'll talk about. I described this a meeting or 2 ago, but the intergovernmental agreement basically lets the authority have assets, employees, defines the powers of the authority, defines the financial terms between Metro and the East Bank Development Authority, and the length of the agreement. On the real estate, this is a valuable asset that Metro would convey. The 30 acres that are subject to the Fallon Master Development Agreement, the plaza that will sit between the Titan Stadium and Fallon's development area. And then once the site of the building we're in now once this is demolished, this land will go from the Sports Authority to Metro under agreements from a few years ago, and then from Metro to the East Bank Development Authority. What would not be conveyed at this time is any of the other land on the East Bank that the city owns. The city has a total of 130 acres, and so it wouldn't be everything on the East Bank that Metro owns. We would anticipate that in future years, if further development agreements are done, then at that time, the council would do those development agreements and convey the land and the development agreements to the authority at that time. And then while we expect the authority to last a long time, decades, many decades, if for whatever reasons it ceases to exist, Metro gets its land back. This is a drawing you've seen before that shows the 30 acres that are subject to the Fallon Agreement are the parcels listed as A, B, C, D, E1, E2, F, and G. And the plaza that I referred to is the space between parcel C and the football stadium. That plaza Metro owns, and that will be conveyed to the authority also. contracts. There will be contracts assigned from Metro to the authority. When we did the master development agreement a year ago, it was drafted to be able to be assigned to the authority, which didn't exist at the time, but we set it up so those development agreements could be assigned and have the authority stand in Metro's shoes. And so that is probably the most valuable asset that would be conveyed, the master development agreement in related terms. That's the 99-year development agreement that has full market rent once the buildings are built, and the affordable housing and everything that we've talked about being in the development agreement would be conveyed to the authority. Then there's three other agreements. The second bullet point is last year, at the time of the development agreement, Metro and the Titans and Fallon entered several three-party agreements that basically set up the ground rules of how everybody would work together, where neighboring properties touch each other. So it's control and use of the plaza, control and use of other public spaces where Fallon and Metro and the team all come together. And then the third bullet point refers to three contracts where right now Metro is doing the work of the East Bank. We've got a program manager contract with HDR that is currently housed in our planning department. And then there's a civil engineering contract housed in our NDOT department and a contract to develop the East Bank Boulevard that's also through NDOT. Those three contracts are active contracts, work are being done now. They will be assigned to the authority.
Just
We always using Fallon.
That's right.
right. Okay. Since we're looking at the nitty gritty of the document, Fallon legally is TSC National Development LLC. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
In terms of the agreements, I have not yet looked at any of these agreements that are going to be transferred to the authority. I think it would be wise for us to know what we're getting. So between now and next time it's on the agenda for approval, we'll do some due diligence in those contracts so we know exactly what we're getting.
That makes sense. And I think one of the things that I'm sure Mr. Solomon will look at with that is who on Metro's side is working on those contracts, who's the interface. I think you'll find that it's Mr. York and Ms. Grider and our program management team are the ones that are interfacing, because it will be important to get contracts, get the funding for the contracts, and make sure that the people who are working on them are all a package together. So I think that's a smart idea.
Hey, Bob, a couple quick questions.
Sure.
You mentioned a couple of slides back about a certain amount of land that's going to be transferred and a certain amount of land that's not going to be transferred. Well, why would that be not 100% if it's the East Bank Authority? Is my first question. The second question, where do we stand on the potential CEO of the authority? And I think to Saul's point about reviewing the documents, wouldn't it be wise if he was on board to review the documents before he accepted those documents? Those contracts?
Yeah, I'll take the second question first. When we were here last, I said we'd have a CEO figured out by the end of March. I think first week in April is when I'm thinking, which will leave time for this. So we'll have that covered. I completely agree with you. It's critical, I think, that there be a CEO by the time you guys vote on this to do a review like that so you could hear from that person about a comfort level. And then the first question about the land, the clear direction we got a year ago from the council is that they did not want to be excluded from future development agreements for future acreage. And to be real frank, we don't think that we could have gotten it through the council last summer to get the authority created if we had taken the position that all of Metro-owned land would go to the authority. So and that's consistent with the mayor's view that whether to do a deal for developing certain land is the purview of the council, and executing on it is the purview of the authority. And so we're conveying the 30 acres that are subject to the development agreement, the acres that are under this building we're in now, the current Nissan Stadium. And the reason to convey the acres under the current football stadium are the city already has obligations about what to do with that in connection with the new football stadium construction site. A lot of this will be open space between the new football stadium and the river. And we're likely years away from a next development agreement for further acres. And so that's reserved for a future day.
Real quick, so how many acres are being transferred to the East Bank Development Board?
Approximately 30.
Those 30 or new 30? You said
This
that those,
30. The 30 depicted by A, B, C, D, E1, E2, F, and G.
So then my question, if that's the only 30 acres coming over, what's the point of this board? Because it's already predetermined what those are. I don't know what our authority is at that point. You got 30 acres. It's already been described about what's going on those 30 acres. So what is the point of this board?
Well, the East Bank Development Authority covers a full 550 acres, and a substantial part of the point is to work on the infrastructure straight up and down the East Bank. And a couple slides down the road, we talk about the capital spending power that's already been approved that'll be moved over to the authority. There's some 100 million plus worth of previously approved capital spending that is mostly infrastructure as far north as the River North campus. So it's the East Bank Development Authority. The job isn't just to oversee the 99-year multi-billion-dollar contracts, but it's also to work on getting the infrastructure in the ground in the rest of the East Bank.
But just for the point, not to belabor the point, those contracts have already been approved before they ever got to us, correct?
Yes.
So once again, to our attorney, can we change those contracts, or are we bound by those right now? By decisions not made by this board?
Right, you're bound by those as the S&A, yeah.
Thanks.
All right. I think this is where we left off. For those of you who are new to how Metro does capital spending, it's a little obscure, but here it is in a nutshell. In order to qualify for capital spending, projects must appear in what we call a capital improvements budget. And our capital improvements budget, sometimes inside of Metro, is referred to as wish list. It includes all sorts of things, several $1 billion worth of things. In order to go from being on the wish list, the capital improvements budget, to actually being able to spend money, it has to appear in what's called a capital spending plan, call it a CSP. And once a project appears in a CSP, then it's eligible for spending. There are some $100 million plus dollars worth of previously approved capital spending dollars that haven't been spent yet that relate to the East Bank. The middle bullet point shows what some of those are. There's somewhere around half that money is for right-of-way acquisition between James Robertson Parkway and Jefferson Street. There's a big chunk of previously approved money for infrastructure in the River North area, which abuts where the Oracle campus will be, and also the program management dollars for the full 550 acres. And then there's additionally the balance of the 100 plus million is related to the Metro-owned land on the East Bank. Some of it related to commitments the city has around the new football stadium, and all of that capital spending, the balance, the original authorization was around 125 million. The balance that's left unspent right now is about 105 million. That would be transferred to the authority. All of that relates to contracts that are currently underway, projects that are underway. The right-of-way acquisition, for example, we're mid-process working with NDOT and TDOT to acquire the right-of-way needed for the East Bank Boulevard between the railroad tracks and Jefferson Street. Let me pause there and see if there's questions on this slide.
Exhibit F in the,
Yes, sir.
okay.
And because I know you'll ask this at some point, Mr. Granberry. The Exhibit F lists the originally approved amounts, which is $125 million, not the current balances because, we're spending today. And so if we tried to figure out an exact balance, the only thing we'd know is we wouldn't get it exactly right. And so we're, I can tell you the balance is about 105 million right now. And by the time it gets approved by both bodies, it'll be a somewhat different number. And so that's why we put the Exhibit F with the originally approved amounts.
Okay, thanks.
For employees, the agreement lays out that for current Metro employees working exclusively on the East Bank, of which there are two, that control their day-to-day activities would be transferred to the East Bank Development Authority. New employees would be hired by the CEO. And then one of the things that I think y'all will have to do during the summer is figure out compensation benefits packages for the newly hired employees into the authority. We know from our experience in standing up a convention center authority about a decade ago that we'll still be able to piggyback a lot on Metro policies and Metro programs. But there may be some places like the Convention Center Authority, I believe, has a separate 401k. And so there's some benefits they decided to do differently. Y'all, I think, will need to work with management of the authority once it gets to be summer to figure out exactly what those packages are going to look like.
Bob, question on that. In terms of, I guess, using the convention center as an example, for employees of the EBDA, does some of the back end work, for instance, your HR back end, your hiring papers, not the actual benefits given, but is there some administrative support that would continue to come from Metro, or does the development authority itself also need to be, contracting for HR support and for all the various different sort of administrative sides of having employees?
We've, and I know a lot of us in the room have been business owners and had to jump through those hoops, and it can be a challenge, especially to make it all appear on one day. So we've drafted the intergovernmental agreement to be flexible, to allow Metro HR, IT services, for example, that's a big one, to provide services on day one. And the way Metro departments work as it is, administrative charges are applied to departments inside Metro, and the authority will have a fallback on day one. It's not going to be left wanting. It'll be able to rely on Metro services and be charged at the same rate that other departments. So there's no profiteering there. It's the same charge as another department would get. And then rolling forward, if the authority decided we want our own HR function or we want our own IT function, it would be able to be spun off in an a la carte fashion and cut those charges off. So we've tried to make it flexible to make sure that there's, we don't have to predict what the world will look like 12 or 24 months from now. We've got the ability to piggyback on Metro services. This is one where Mr. Solomon and I will both comment. The let me start with the guiding principles bullet point in the middle. I've tried to describe this before, but the idea is that key development policy decisions need to remain with the council to some degree. They can have a vote in it, mayor's office and the council, the general government. And then the East Bank Development Authority is charged with planning, recommending, implementing, and executing on tasks related to those policy decisions. And again, this is, it's unprecedented in the history of Metro, the value of this 99-year development agreement. It's not like executing on the day-to-day is not something that Metro government's got experience with. Like executing on that is, and the challenges that are unique to it in the history of Metro is one of the main reasons we wanted the authority. And then there were certain things that the legislation passed through the state legislature and the council last year demanded, and that's the third and fourth bullet point. The enabling legislation doesn't let the authority incur any debt without the council approving it. That was important, I think, in both legislative bodies. There's no land use or zoning powers conveyed to the authority, and no eminent domain powers, which I think was also important in both legislative bodies who created the enabling legislation. I'll turn this over to Mr. Solomon.
Just to make it clear, the act would allow the East Bank Development Authority to basically operate without council approval. There's no doubt that that's permitted under the act. What's also permitted under the act, although I wish it was drafted a little bit better, is that the authority does not have to proceed without Metro Council approval. In other words, if it wishes to proceed with Metro Council approval only, that's permitted under the act, and that is the way that the administration has basically positioned this. So if you look at the totality of the agreement, I think what Bob has sort of said is that, and to kind of piggyback on the speaker's comment, at least initially, this is more an execution body than a decision-making, I guess, body in terms of at least the authority itself is more to execute on what's already been agreed to on the infrastructure. As far as future land, who knows what's going to happen? I mean, Mr. Mendez assumes that it's going to be council is going to approve something and the contract's going to be assigned, but the agreements are all silent on that. So if the authority's up and running and people like what they're doing, who knows what's going to happen with future land. But for now, it's really executing on the infrastructure, executing on the Fallon Agreement, I would say, are the major things. And everything and anything you do in terms of disposition of property is subject to the approval of the council. That's how the intergovernmental agreement is drafted right now. So just want to make that clear.
And the only thing I would add to that is the main job over the next several years is infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. This whole thing is not going to be built without likely many hundreds of millions of dollars worth of infrastructure going in the ground by somebody, whether it's local government, private parties, other governmental entities at different levels funding it. There's hundreds of millions of dollars worth of infrastructure to do. This authority does have substantial powers to come up with funding mechanisms for the infrastructure, whether it's tax increment financing, redevelopment districts, business improvement districts, parking authorities. All those powers are tied up with this body, and I will tell whoever the CEO is going to be that by the time we get a couple of years down the road, there needs to be a substantial understanding about how we're paying for the infrastructure, and that will require some amount of debt. And under the enabling legislation, everything that's debt related has to pass both bodies. There were elements of the state legislature and elements in the council who did not want this body to have unilateral authority to create debt. without the council weighing in on it.
I got one question.
Sure.
On the slide, it says what to build, when to build, and how to pay for it remain with the council, meaning Metro. You just said we had taxation policy or ability to tax. This authority does. Is that accurate without Metro Council's approval?
No, the enabling legislation required both bodies to approve that.
Okay, so just to be clear, we don't have that ability to do that. Fees, we have the ability to impose fees, or does that need to go through Metro Council?
The enabling legislation from last year, passed by the state, adopted here, requires anything that is that kind of revenue generating to be approved in both places.
Okay, my point again. Thank you.
As for, and this slide relates to operating expenses for the authority. At this time, the authority has no revenue because there's no rent coming in. 5 years from now, 4 years from now, there should be rent coming in. And so for now, the agreement calls for Metro to be obligated to fund the annual operating budget of the East Bank Development Authority. And then once revenue is greater than expenses, the revenue would be used first to cover operating expenses. Second, excess revenue would be used equally to fund an operating reserve up to 100% of annual expenses and to repay what Metro invested up front for operating expenses. And then after that, remaining funds get paid to the general fund. Importantly, like, this is operating expenses, so rent revenue. If there's capital improvement funding mechanisms that are created, whether it's redevelopment districts, business improvement districts, all of that funding would be handled by whatever agreements this body and the council made in the future. And that would operate separately than these operating expense and revenue agreements.
And on the repayment to Metro prong of that, that would be, I mean, for the entirety of the project, right? So if Metro's shouldering expenses today and the revenue is not actually generating sufficiently until year 5, still years 1 through 5, where there's that excess beyond the 100% of the 100% cushion, Metro would be paid back for all that 1 through 5 expense, right?
Yeah.
So on the flow of funds, just to make it absolutely clear, there's no ability to build funds for capital spending. So that's just, that's just to make that clear. Once there's an excess, it goes back to the general fund.
One question. But we are collecting funds over time because ultimately we'll be here for 20 plus years. And so we'll have infrastructure improvements, we'll have maintenance that we will have to use that funding to maintain the property, and this board would oversee. Once things are already in place through contracts, we'll oversee the long-term maintenance of the property, right?
Yeah, if it's deemed an operating expense of the authority, then that gets paid first. The length of the agreement, it's intended to last a long time. It can be amended in the future with the agreement of the council and this body. It can be terminated by mutual agreement, or if there's a default. I'll skip to the caveat at the bottom at this point. It can't be ended if third-party rights would be impacted. So, for example, if in the future there was a bond issuance that was approved by this body and then the council also, and there was debt incurred and that was being repaid from say, property tax revenue, then we Metro and the authority couldn't just unilaterally end the authority and leave bondholders hanging. So the ability to terminate it by anybody would be subject to can't impair the rights of third parties. And then events of default are pretty basic. It's if there's either party fails to perform its obligations under the agreement, or if Metro's control is eroded of the authority, then that would create a termination event, assuming it doesn't impair something like bond rights. And I think that's it.
I have a question.
Sure.
If it is terminated under one of those circumstances, where does that leave? Do we go back to the drawing board for a new intergovernmental agreement, or what would happen?
Well, Chair, this is one of those things that, it's a good lawyer question. The intent is to not have it end, right? The intent is to have it last as long as the development agreements last. If we all collectively found ourselves in the awkward position where somehow one party was breaching and the other party felt strongly enough about it to terminate the agreement, and there weren't third parties, I think everybody would want to question, what the nature of the relationship was going forward. Can't draft a contract without a termination provision. So it would be messy. It would be messy if that happened. Hopefully we don't find out.
It's basically it's an unwinding of it. Basically, all the property would go back to Metro and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's basically an unwinding process.
Question. In terms of operating revenue, before the body starts receiving rental revenue in those, in this 4 to 5 year time frame, would we assume that our CEO is going through the same process that other Metro departments and requesting operating revenue through the mayor's budget, council approval?
Yes,
Okay.
That's what'll happen. And first time up will be this operating budget coming up here, released in beginning of May. Assuming we have traction by then to in both bodies to move forward with approving this, it'll have to appear in the operating budget, we view that as a good thing, in that we really can't get the authority up and going without Metro investing in it, and so Metro has a say in that. And so it's a good opportunity to make sure that everybody values the work the authority is doing.
Thank you.
I've got a question. I noticed towards the end there's a dispute resolution provision that I will say from the start, it seems very unlikely that Metro and the authority are ever at a point where it's triggered. But if we were, and there's a dispute between Metro and the authority, currently that dispute is sent to arbitration. I certainly have a strong preference for going to court, Chancery Court, but separate from that, I do think a dispute between this authority and Metro would have to be public, and often arbitration is thought to be private, and so I'm not saying I'm necessarily opposed to arbitration, but I do think it would be important to amend this section to at least be clear that it would be a public arbitration open to whoever wants to attend with an open docket. Again, my preference would be just, state court. We're under state law, under the governing law. We could, be in Chancery Court. But again, I just think we want to make sure that there's no doubt that it's a public process.
Fine. I had very little input in this agreement. He picked on one of the clauses that I actually drafted, so just for the record.
I thought you drafted the whole thing.
Mr. Tift, I think what we'll do is, we've got this meeting today for comments like that, and then we'll have the council committee meeting sometime in mid-April, and that'll put us in a position to see whether comments made by one or both groups should be built into the agreement. And we've got time to. There's nothing that says there can't be changes between now and the next time y'all meet. So I appreciate that feedback.
Just point of clarification. So let's say that more property is being developed and Metro wants to do one thing and this board wants to go a different route. What happens then? Or does it matter at that point?
The agreement says that both the authority and Metro have to agree to I believe it says this, have to agree to additional transfers of property. And so Metro can't unilaterally give you property without your approval.
Right, but what goes on that property? Let's say that they transfer property, right? And it says that they approve what is built or not. Let's say that they transfer the property. We say we need X. They say they need Y. There's a disagreement between the two. What happens?
Anything you want to do with any property has to be approved by Metro Council. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe a follow-on on the speaker's question. For good reasons, based on the timeline of this, we pretty much always talking about Metro and land that's conveyed, but of course the 500-plus acres has a lot of private land. Some of it River North, there's already a plan in place for. Some of it there's not a plan for. And so I guess a related question, if we're not talking about Metro, imagine hypothetical private landowner A, who's on one of these properties, decides they want to do whatever they want to do. Certainly understand if it requires a zoning change, that's going to go through Metro. All the sort of planning and zoning process would go through Metro. But there wouldn't be a conveyance. Obviously, it's private land, so there wouldn't be a conveyance from Metro with terms already on what can be done there outside of zoning. So I'm asking a hypothetical question without having like a great frame of what would happen in that case. So could y'all, how would our authority differ when private land is seeking to be developed that's within the East Bank?
Yeah. Story. Let's talk about the scrapyard hypothetically. The scrapyard, should it ever be sold to somebody, one day will want to do something other than have a scrapyard on it. And when that happens, there's going to be umpteen questions. What's it zoned? What's its density? Surely somebody's going to put a road through the middle of it. Surely that's going to be a government-owned road. How does that get paid for? What happens with the utilities? There's a pile of questions that'll come up with it, and there's unavoidable, just like when MDHA wants to redevelop something, it can't help but have a conversation that involves both MDHA and Metro. For the scrapyard, as an example, it would be unavoidably a conversation that deeply involves the authority and Metro. Metro would have the lead say on zoning, land use, height, density, et cetera. When it comes to infrastructure that's going to go through there, connecting to the East Bank Boulevard, connecting to utilities that are going to be in the East Bank Boulevard, like those are things where we anticipate that one of the great things about having the authority is that while that is boring to a lot of people and underground and nobody's ever going to see it after it's done, like making that sensible should be primarily authority role. And then there's a couple of members have individually asked me questions about design review committee. MDHA has a design review committee, which is an extra layer of design. It could be, depending on what financial mechanisms the authority comes up with in future years to pay for infrastructure. It could be that there's an additional design review component that the authority takes care of. With this intergovernmental agreement, because of the inherent hypothetical nature of, we don't know whether that conversation is 6 months or 6 years or 16 years from now. We've tried to leave the framework of the intergovernmental agreement to allow lots of flexibility for Metro and the authority to interact as in ways that we don't have to precisely define today. But there's definitely going to be a role for both if something like that were to happen.
Are there any other questions? Anything else from the two of you?
I don't think so.
Then that concludes the agenda for today's meeting, and we'll adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.